Thank you very much, Omar, and good morning, everyone. A great pleasure to be here. This is a place that I have a lot of fond memories for. We've worked way back together on services in Egypt and how to assist the Egyptian government in reaching informed decisions about services, policies, reforms, and regulatory reforms. Now, Omnia just gave an excellent presentation about trade and services and the statistical details about what's happening in services in Egypt. Let me just pick on three important points I don't want to get in too much detail about, but they're terribly important in understanding the big picture. The first is, when we talk about trade and services, the word trade always comes to mind as like in merchandise trade, one product crossing the border from one country to another and payment in the opposite direction. Actually, trade and services was a historical turn in terms of defining what international trade means, because trade and services encompasses also investment. This is the biggest chunk. It covers other things like labor mobility, consumption abroad, like in the case of tourism, but the most significant and biggest chunk of international trade and services, which accounts for about 55 to 60% of international trade and services, is through what we call Mode 3, establishment of commercial presence. A UBS bank or an HSBC bank establishing a subsidiary or a branch in Egypt. That's an export of service through commercial presence. Now, why is this so important? Because immediately for a country like Egypt that is struggling to get its investment policies and investment regulation right, there has to be a realization that actually when we talk about investment, you're talking also about trade as defined in the WTO. It's not just investment, it's trade policy. And why is services important in the investment context? Because in today's world, services account for 2/3 of global FDI stock. 2/3 of global FDI stock is in the services sector. Of course, Omar mentioned earlier that in terms of global GDP, services account for 70%. 70% is very impressive, but what is also impressive is to see where that came from. In 1970, that percentage was only 53%. So the trajectory is very clear. Not only that, but what is coming next is even bigger because the rate of change is exponential. So we're looking at a very strategic part of what is happening in the global economy and also what is happening in Egypt. So my first point is trade and services is also investment. I was watching what's happening in Egypt very closely and looking how the investment policy is progressing. And one of the things that I've observed is, why hasn't there been any mention of trade policy? Because it's very difficult in today's world to have a sound investment policy that does not have a matching, compatible and supportive trade policy. In terms of the overlap with services that I talked about, but also in terms of cross-border transactions, flows of merchandise. We live in a world of global value chains. I'll come to that in a minute. The other point that Omnia referred to, which I want to stress, is we've been talking about liberalization of services. Let's be very careful about what we mean by liberalization. We don't mean deregulation. Liberalization is not deregulation. Actually, I always say the more you liberalize, the more you need to regulate. Because the paradigm shift of services, moving from being government functions performed by public utility entities into being commercial products exchanged in competitive markets, meant actually that the government regulatory role becomes very crucial. And it's very sophisticated and challenging. It's about the rules and also about the institutions. Now, we're not talking about deregulation. The financial crisis of 2008 is full of lessons. We can have an independent seminar on that. It was about regulatory failures. It was not about liberalization or market opening. Just compare Canada with the US. In terms of liberalization, they were comparable in terms of levels of opening, but the effects of the financial crisis was very, very different. Now, the third thing that I want to emphasize in what Omnia said is about data. Be very careful with data when it comes to services. Because the data that we use, for example, in presentations and economists use in their analysis, and I've always had a problem with economists. I'm a lawyer myself, and nobody's perfect. But they use the data that they find, and mostly it is balance of payments data. IMF balance of payments statistics, which are based on transactions between residents and non-residents, which completely does not take into account what we call Mode 3, investment. And Mode 3, supply of services through commercial presence, as I said, accounts for 55 to 60% of international trade and services. So the statistics about trade and services, when economists say that trade and services is 20% of global trade, that's hugely off the mark, because that leaves out almost 60% of services trade. Now, moving on to the first point I wanted to raise with you, and of course I take it that this paper was circulated. I did a short note. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I did a short note for this discussion. I'm not going to repeat what's in it, but just highlight one point after the other. Global value chains. We live in a very different world today that actually thrives in terms of its evolution on the services sector. It thrives on new technologies, it thrives on globalized financial markets, and it thrives on the increasingly smoothened cross-border transactions, be it goods or services. So we live in a world of global value chains. And global value chains is a phenomenon that is captured by a lot of market operators today, be it in manufacturing, be it in services, and it's about producing different parts and different components of a product, be it a good or a service, in different countries around the world. So you actually dismantle the production process and place each stage of it in the most cost-effective jurisdiction that actually gathers within it, locationally, the factors that you need in order to optimize the efficiency of your operation. This is where you find the best IT specialists. This is where you find the best lawyers. This is where, I wonder where that place is. This is where you find the best high-tech industry. This is where you find the best manufacturers of screens. So if you look at the iPhone and how it is manufactured, or the iPad, it is quite interesting to see where the value added actually has been generated across many countries. This is what we call global value chains. The interesting thing is that every time I say this, people say to me, yes, but particularly in developing countries, but you're talking about sophisticated industries, the iPhone, the Volvo car, the iPad. You know, developing countries are struggling with more basic industries. So I asked friends of mine that I have in a think tank in Hong Kong, in the Fung Institute. I said, could you do a case study, an empirical case study about a product that is quite basic, and see how the value added is constructed? Indeed, they did a study on the loaf of bread. Now, it doesn't get any more basic than that. And how the loaf of bread produced in China, South China, and sold through bakery chains in South China and in Hong Kong, how the value added was constructed. And believe it or not, actually I have a study which I can send to Sharif to be circulated. It's a very interesting study, 13 pages. The share of services in the cost of producing a loaf of bread turned out to be 72%. 72%. So if you buy a loaf of bread that costs $1, 72 cents of that dollar are actually services. And the study lists those services. It's about 30 services that go into that production operation. Now, how many countries around the world actually are struggling to put a loaf of bread on the table of poor people? Certainly, in our case, that is true. So, the importance of services is becoming clearer and clearer to policymakers, but also to business operators. Because another feature of that is the evolution of business models. And this is terribly important, what we refer to as services. Business models are evolving. Even some goods transactions are turning into services transactions. Rolls-Royce, for example, instead of selling you plane engines and fixing them on your aircrafts, and then you pay for the engines, you buy them. Now Rolls-Royce would fix the engines on your planes and bill you for flying hours. Mm-hmm. That's a service. It's called leasing services. There is no, the buyer and seller, in this case what they transact is a service. It's like you renting a car instead of buying a car. So business models are evolving also in a way that produces efficiency gains, but also transform a lot of transactions into a different model, which is what we call services now. All this is very important, and at the same time, you know, there are tremendous opportunities, tremendous gains out of this growth and evolution in the services sector. Actually, this is why it's happening. Nobody slept and dreamt that liberalizing services would be good. It's happening organically because it's the best thing to move from the old paradigm to the new paradigm. It's breeding new innovative practices and new innovative models. And technology is helping a lot. Technology is helping tremendously. But not only technology, it's also policies. Now, moving to Egypt, I was watching what's happening. There are a few things about Egypt here which I mentioned also. I think you would find it interesting. The only thing that I would remind you of in the note is Egypt.
Sorry, I'm not sure everyone has copy of the. Yes, but maybe you can share the information. I mean, okay. You can afford more time and be more elaborate.
Thank you, Omar. One important example about Egypt is that not many people actually know that Egypt is number 6 worldwide in producing fresh vegetables. Number 6 worldwide in producing fresh vegetables. This is according to the Economist Intelligence Unit statistics. These are the figures of 2011, right? And in the statistical book of the Economist of 2014. Before that, Egypt was number 5, but that's a detail. The question is, how come that tremendous production capacity in Egypt is not reflected in Egypt's export performance, nor is it reflected in the conditions of the domestic market? Now, of course, Egypt exports fresh vegetables, of course. But the export capacity doesn't really represent this tremendous production capacity. Why? Because it's one thing to grow tomatoes on the field, it's another to put it on the shelf of a supermarket. And between point A and point B, there's a chain of services. And the failure of that services chain causes a huge competitive disadvantage. To whom? To the farmer. Now, that illustrates a very important policy perspective, which is the interlinkages between different sectors. The farmer never spoke to the Ministry of Transport, never spoke to the Ministry of Trade that deals with the wholesale industry. God knows how they operate and manipulate prices. I'm not accusing anybody. No liabilities here. They don't speak to the transport industry about facilities, refrigeration, storage. They have no connection with the distribution network of retailers. And when it comes to exports, they have no connections beyond their own borders. Now, the failure of the services chain causes what? A waste in the produce that ranges between 30 to 40%, according to a study that was done in 2010. So it really is not only a huge issue, but it concerns every sector in the economy, including farmers, not to speak of manufacturing. Now, the reality also of the services sector, as Omnia said, is that it is actually bigger than manufacturing, agriculture, and non-manufacturing industries combined together. It's the biggest sector in the economy, the biggest employer, the fastest growing, etc., etc. Now, I've been watching what was taking place in Egypt. I mentioned this overlap between investment and trade policy as one important observation. But I was also thinking about services, and I was thinking, Egypt has been moving in the direction of liberalizing services, but liberalizing services in the real sense, not deregulation, but also liberalization is not privatization. You know, you may privatize a monopoly, but then you haven't liberalized. You haven't liberalized anything. The only thing that happens is that the monopoly rent would go from a public pocket into a private pocket. Great. Nothing happens. The essence, the real essence of liberalization, really, is competition. I always joke about it, and I say it's three things. It's competition, it's competition, it's competition. If you don't achieve a competitive environment, you have not liberalized. The government can own as many entities, as many companies as it wants. It has to be operated on a commercial basis. But what we're talking about really is competition, because this is what brings the welfare gains of lower prices, better quality, broader choices, and it feeds into every productive activity in the country. Not only that services are a determinant of competitiveness, but also they are a determinant of the quality of life, the level of social welfare. Every government is struggling to improve the lives of its citizens. The education for our children, the insurance coverage we have, the health care we have, the banking that we have access to. That's why access to services has been one of the most important issues, even in Egypt here. When work started and was discontinued, I'll come to this in a minute, access is terribly important. 90% of the Egyptian population are unbankable. In other words, they don't have access to banking. That's a huge issue. It's huge for, not only for consumers, but also for small businesses and for micro businesses. It's a different issue. I'm just highlighting the importance. Now, huge opportunities, absolutely, huge challenges, the regulatory challenge and the policy challenge. Now, how do we go about it? And I was thinking also that a services policy, with all its linkages, it's basically about running the economy. It's not just about one sector. It's about how you run the economy. This needs to take place in a broader policy vision, a broader policy context. Whatever you do on services has to be against a policy backdrop that informs where we're going. And this is one of the things that I observed over the past few months with all the wonderful things that have been happening. The Suez Canal project, I mean, Egypt is really, really moving in the right direction, and it's very inspiring. My observation is about how these pieces actually would come together. What kind of policy vision are we looking at? And I'm looking at the fundamentals that would inform each and every sector, each and every minister, each and every policymaker. Question number one, are we a market economy? Are we a market economy? The answer is presumably yes, because we're not a centrally planned economy anymore. So if we're not a market economy, where do we sleep at night? We have to be somewhere. So the answer is presumably yes. The question that follows is, all right, then the role of competition as a basic ingredient in policymaking has to be prominent. Okay, competition. If one or two fall in place, then if we're a competing economy, then the development of the human element is in our core interest. We want well-educated people. Egypt has huge history, huge culture, huge value system, but to be informed about what's happening in the outside world, how to compete in a globalized economy. And then, at the end, how to have a proper regulatory and legislative system that would put all this together in rules, do's and don'ts of every day. So this is the sort of policy context in which I was thinking about how do you guide the policy making. All this is wonderful. Now, what can we do? ECES actually has been pioneering excellent work on services. We started that, and I had the pleasure and the privilege to start way back with Dr. Hana Khairuddin and Dr. Nagla Al-Ahwani and a team of researchers, some of whom are here, and we're blessed by their presence. And the idea was to, first of all, in order to enable the government and policymakers to take the right path, let's give them the information base. Because an important thing about the services sector is not only the unreliable statistics and data, as we were saying, but also we need to know more about what's happening, the reality in our services sectors. And indeed, we started a diagnostic exercise based on empirical research, evidence-based research papers done by university professors. It came out in this publication. This is a book that some of you might have seen. It is edited by Dr. Hana Khairuddin and Dr. Nagla Al-Ahwani. And this was the first stage in the project. This book came out at the end of 2010. Actually, first print was early 2011, just before the revolution, and the rest is history. So basically, the project didn't go any further. This research was supposed to feed into a policy dialogue that eventually, with the participation of stakeholders, because at this level we were only talking among experts and researchers, to take this to a policy platform with the participation of stakeholders, including private sector business operators, regulators, government officials, and to try and come out with policy recommendations that policymakers and regulators can use, which would be to a level of detail that would say this is the policy recommendations and this is the recommendations about how you put those policies into laws and regulations. What do you need to do? That work was discontinued. My call today is it about time to try and resume the effort again? Maybe to take a look at this and say, all right, this was done in 2010, 10 years, 5 years have passed by. Should we try to take a look at what was done and see how to update it? Because a lot has happened since. Huh? A lot has happened. 5 years is a long time. A lot has happened outside in the global economy, and a lot has happened in Egypt. No need to explain. Maybe, if that is the wish, I'm sure we can mobilize a lot of support internationally from other organizations, not only the WTO. I'm not here actually representing the WTO. I'm here as an Egyptian citizen with a lot of love in my heart and a lot of thought in my mind. The last thing that I would leave with you, I'll bring this to a closure, is that you will see that I did not mention in this paper anything about the negotiations. Nothing about the negotiations. And that is deliberate. Because every time we talk about services, we catch the tiger by the tail. You can't address what would be your negotiating position at the negotiating table. The homework has to be done first. You see, how do you want to take your services sector forward? What do you want to do? And if you do that, your negotiating position would fall in place. This is why deliberately I haven't mentioned negotiations. Having said that, negotiations actually can be utilized in a very useful way to mobilize focus internally. You can say, listen, we have a negotiation, not only in the WTO, but my understanding is that Egypt is about to start deep negotiations with the European Union to say, look, we're negotiating serious agreements that will have implications. Therefore, we need to have this consultative process. We need to have this policy-making dialogue in order to take the right path. Let me stop here, and I apologize, Omar, for taking